The car turned sharply, taking a corner too fast, but the officer kept his cool. He had no idea where this was heading, but he couldn't afford to lose them now. He had to know what was going on, had to understand why this whole night had spiraled into a nightmare. The pursuit led him into an abandoned industrial complex on the edge of town. The black sedan pulled into a dark alleyway, and for a moment, everything went quiet. The officer's hands gripped the steering wheel, every nerve on edge. He parked his car a few yards away, heart thumping in his chest. He took a deep breath and stepped out of his vehicle, trying to stay calm. There was no turning back now. The agent had to know something about whatever was going on, something the officer could use to make sense of everything. He approached the sedan cautiously, his hand on his gun, but he didn't draw it. Not yet. He wasn't sure if he should confront the agent directly or wait for a better opening. But as he reached the car, the door creaked open, and the agent stepped out, his face hard, his eyes narrowed with a mix of determination and regret. The figure in the backseat stayed hidden, watching from the shadows. "You really shouldn't have followed us," the agent said quietly, his voice low and tense. There was no hint of anger, just a cold warning. The officer's breath caught in his throat. "What is this? What's really going on here?" His voice was shaky, but he stood his ground. He needed answers, needed to understand the truth. The agent hesitated, glancing over his shoulder at the figure still inside the car. Then he spoke again, quieter this time. "This isn't something you can fix, not for someone like you." The words hit the officer like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean by that?" he demanded, taking a step forward. Just then, the figure in the backseat finally moved. The officer couldn't see their face, but he could tell it was a woman. She stepped out of the car with a swift, deliberate motion, her eyes locked on the officer. And then the world tilted. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice cold, almost too calm. The officer's stomach dropped as he recognized her. It was someone he knew. Someone from his own department. The shock hit him like a freight train. He couldn't speak, couldn't process what was happening. His mind was in overdrive, piecing together the puzzle. How had she gotten involved? You're with them," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "I'm sorry, but this was the only way." Before he could react, the agent moved toward him, his hand gripping the officer's arm with a surprising amount of strength. "You're not going to walk away from this. Not anymore." And with that, the officer's world was turned upside down. He had just been pulled into a far deeper conspiracy than he could have ever imagined. The agent, the woman, the entire night, it had all been set up. And now there was no way out. The stakes were higher than he could comprehend, and everything he thought he knew about the job, about the people he trusted, had just been shattered. He was in the middle of something much bigger than he could have ever predicted. And this was only the beginning. The officer stood frozen, his mind spinning. The woman, his colleague, was the last person he expected to see standing there, not like this. She had always been one of the good ones, the kind of person you trusted. The kind of person who helped you when things went sideways. But now her cold eyes told a different story, and the weight of her gaze felt like a final judgment. The agent held him steady, his grip firm but not hostile, as if he were waiting for something. The officer couldn't speak, couldn't understand how everything he thought he knew had been appended in a matter of hours. How had he gotten dragged into something so deep, something so dangerous, that it involved people he thought were on his side? Why? The word slipped from his lips before he could stop it. He needed answers. He needed to understand. The woman stepped forward, her face betraying no emotion. "I didn't want this for you," she said, her voice almost apologetic. "But you were never supposed to get involved. We were careful. Too careful. And you followed us." The officer shook his head, still trying to process the enormity of the moment. "I followed you because I thought you were in trouble." "What is all this? What are you involved in?" The officer's instincts screamed at him. This wasn't just some random person passing through. This was planned. Deliberate. The FBI agent slowly pushed his door open, stepping out with careful, measured movements. "Stay behind me," he muttered under his breath. But the officer wasn't used to taking orders, especially when he had no idea what was happening. "Who are they?" he whispered. The agent didn't answer. His focus was locked on the dark figure stepping out of the car. The officer could barely make out the silhouette. Tall, broad shoulders, moving with confidence. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They knew they had control of the situation. Then finally, a voice cut through the silence. Low, steady, unshaken. "You should have listened." And just like that, the officer knew he was in way over his head. The officer's breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped closer, his shadow stretching long across the lot. The agent stiffened beside him, his jaw set, but the officer could see the slightest tremor in his hands. Whoever this was, whatever was happening, he wasn't prepared for it. "You don't know what you're dealing with," the figure said again, his voice barely above a whisper, but it cut through the stillness like a blade. The agent took a step forward, his posture rigid. "This isn't your business," he said, but his voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. The officer caught it, his suspicion deepening. The figure's lips curled into a thin, almost predatory smile. "You're wrong." In a flash, the figure lunged. The officer didn't even have time to react before the man was on the agent, pushing him to the ground. The whole scene seemed to happen in slow motion. The officer was still processing what was going on when the agent's gun was ripped from its holster and pointed directly at the officer's face. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. The officer's heart was pounding in his ears, and he could feel the weight of the gun's muzzle aimed at him. His fingers twitched at his side, instinctively reaching for his own weapon, but he froze. The agent's eyes were wide, his expression filled with something new, fear. "Don't move." The agent's voice was sharp, but there was a tremble beneath the command. The officer's mind raced. What was going on? Why was the agent threatening him? What had just happened to the situation he'd walked into? But just as quickly as the gun was raised, it was lowered. The figure who had attacked the agent was standing behind him now, holding something shiny in his hand. The officer couldn't tell what it was, but the way the man gripped it, firm, deliberate, he knew it was dangerous. "Get in the car," the figure commanded the agent, his tone cold. "Now." The agent hesitated for a moment, glancing over at the officer. There was no time to process the confusion, no time for words. The agent knew he had no choice. Slowly, the agent stood, his eyes meeting the officer's. There was a flicker of something in his gaze. Was it regret? Guilt? Then the agent turned and walked toward the car, his body tense, every step deliberate. The officer stood frozen, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He knew he was witnessing something much bigger than a simple traffic stop gone wrong. But what was it? What was the agent involved in? The officer's instincts screamed at him to act, to stop the agent from leaving with the man in the dark. But his hand was still hovering near his gun. Something about this situation felt wrong. Too wrong. He wasn't sure who to trust anymore. As the agent opened the door to the car, the figure glanced back at the officer, his eyes cold. "You're not leaving until this is over," he said, his voice laced with an ominous finality. The officer's stomach turned. He had no idea what this was, but he knew one thing for sure. He was in deeper than he ever imagined. And whatever was coming next, he wasn't ready for it. The officer stood there, his mind reeling as the agent, and the figure climbed into the dark car. It was all happening too fast. He felt paralyzed, caught in a web of confusion and fear. Every instinct told him to take action, but the truth was, he didn't know who to trust. Should he confront them, call for backup? But just as he was about to make a move, the car's engine roared to life, pulling him back from his thoughts. He couldn't let them go, not like this. With his heart racing, the officer bolted toward his own patrol car, slamming the door behind him. He flicked on his siren and punched the accelerator, tailing the black sedan down the narrow street. The glow of the headlights reflected off the asphalt, casting long shadows as he kept his distance, trying not to alert them that he was following. The officer stood there, watching the taillights of the black sedan fade into the distance. His heart was still pounding. The whole interaction had been brief, almost uneventful on the surface. But something about it gnawed at him. It wasn't just the fact that he pulled over an FBI agent by mistake. It was the way the agent reacted. That controlled, measured silence. That vague, almost dismissive response. "You don't want to know." The words echoed in his mind as he slowly walked back to his patrol car. He had been on the force long enough to know when someone was hiding something. And this agent, he wasn't just being secretive. He was warning him. Sliding into the driver's seat, the officer reached for his radio but hesitated. What was he supposed to say? "Hey, just pulled over a Fed." He gave me a weird look and drove off. No, that would make him sound paranoid. But something inside him refused to let it go. He replayed the encounter in his mind, trying to figure out what didn't sit right. The agent wasn't nervous. He wasn't frustrated. If anything, he seemed cautious, as if he knew something the officer didn't. He checked the dashcam footage, watching the short exchange again. The agent's face was calm, unreadable. But then, just before he drove off, there was something in his eyes, something the camera wouldn't pick up. Was it concern? A warning? The officer couldn't tell. Just then, a new call crackled over at his radio, an incident a few miles away. A suspicious vehicle, parked in a deserted lot near an industrial area. Dispatch didn't have many details, just that a witness reported seeing someone lurking around. The officer exhaled sharply, shaking off his thoughts. He had a job to do. As he pulled onto the road, he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. The FBI agent, the odd encounter, the strange tension, it all felt connected, though he had no proof. 10 minutes later, he arrived at the location. The area was dark, with only a few flickering streetlights casting long shadows. A single black SUV sat near the edge of the lot, engine off, windows tinted. The officer's instincts kicked in immediately. Something about this felt off. He radioed in his location and stepped out, keeping a firm grip on his flashlight. As he approached, he could see faint movement inside the SUV. Someone was in there, someone watching. A chill ran down his spine as he tapped on the window. "Police." "Roll it down." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, the window lowered just enough for him to see a pair of sharp, focused eyes staring back at him. The officer's breath hitched. It was the FBI agent. And this time, he didn't look calm. He looked serious, urgent. "You really shouldn't be here," the agent said quietly. The officer's pulse quickened. He had stepped into something way over his head. And now there was no turning back. The officer's hand hovered near his holster, every muscle in his body tense. The way the FBI agent was looking at him, it wasn't frustration or annoyance. It was something deeper. Urgency. Maybe even fear. "What do you mean I shouldn't be here?" the officer asked, his voice low but firm. The agent glanced around the dark lot, as if checking for something or someone. Then he exhaled sharply. "Listen, you need to leave. Right now." His voice was controlled, but the tension in it was impossible to ignore. The officer's pulse pounded in his ears. He had been in plenty of dangerous situations before, but this was different. This wasn't just a suspicious vehicle or a routine stop. This was something bigger, something he wasn't supposed to know about. "I can't just leave," the officer said, his grip tightening around his flashlight. Dispatch called in a report. "Suspicious activity. If there's something going on here, I need to know." The agent's jaw clenched. He looked like he was debating something in his head, weighing his options. Then he spoke, his voice quieter this time. "There are people watching this place. People who don't want attention. If they see you here, it's not going to end well." A chill ran down the officer's spine. "Who's watching?" Before the agent could answer, the sound of tires crunching against gravel made them both freeze. A car was approaching from the far end of the lot, its headlights off, its dark shape barely visible against the night. The agent's entire demeanor changed in an instant. He shifted in his seat, reaching for something inside his jacket. "It's too late," he muttered. The officer took a step back, eyes locked on the approaching vehicle. His mind was racing. Who was in that car? Why was the agent so tense? And why did it feel like he had just stepped into something way beyond his pay grade? The car slowed to a stop a few yards away. The driver's side door opened, but the interior light didn't come on. Whoever was inside didn't want to be seen. Blue and red lights flash against the dark pavement. A police siren wails, cutting through the quiet of the night. On a quiet stretch of highway, an officer steps out of his patrol car, adjusting his belt as he approaches a sleek black sedan. He doesn't know it yet, but he's about to make a mistake that will change his night, and possibly his career forever. Inside the car, the driver remains calm, hands gripping the steering wheel, eyes watching the officer approach through the side mirror. He's been pulled over before, but this time feels different. The officer's posture, the way his hand lingers near his holster. It's clear he thinks he's dealing with just another routine stop. But this driver is far from ordinary. The officer taps on the window. "License and registration." His voice is firm, authoritative. He's done this 100 times before. The driver exhales slowly, then reaches into his jacket, pulling out his wallet. He hands over a sleek black ID badge, one that carries more weight than any driver's license ever could. The officer's eyes flicker over the name. His brows knit together in confusion before his expression shifts, first to realization, then to something that looks a lot like regret. The badge in his hands reads, **** Federal Bureau of Investigation ***. A tense silence hangs in the air. The officer's heart pounds. He had no idea who he just pulled over. And now he's got a serious problem on his hands. But the FBI agent doesn't say a word. He simply watches, waiting to see how this plays out. Because what happens next will determine everything, whether this is just an awkward misunderstanding or a career-ending mistake. And lucky for us, the whole thing was caught on camera. The officer's grip tightens around the ID badge. His pulse is racing now, but he keeps his face neutral. His mind is scrambling, replaying the last few moments. Did he say anything wrong? Did he do anything that could get him in trouble? Because pulling over an FBI agent is one thing, mishandling the situation is something else entirely. The agent, still seated, tilts his head slightly, studying the officer's reaction. He's been in tense situations before, but this one is different. It's not a high-stakes mission, not an undercover sting. It's a simple traffic stop that's taken a very unexpected turn. And now it's a test of who will keep their cool. The officer clears his throat and forces a polite nod. Is there a reason you were driving without headlights, sir? His voice is still firm, but there's a noticeable shift in his tone. Less commanding, more cautious. The agent rests his hands back on the steering wheel and finally speaks. I was just coming from an assignment. Long day. His voice is calm, controlled. He doesn't offer more details, and he doesn't need to. The badge says enough. The officer glances toward his patrol car, as if weighing his next move. The dash cam is rolling. His radio crackles softly on his shoulder. Should he call this in? Should he act like nothing happened and let the guy go? He swallows hard. No matter what, he knows one thing. This wasn't supposed to happen. The silence between them stretches just long enough to be uncomfortable. The FBI agent doesn't break eye contact, watching how the officer reacts, how he processes the situation. The agent has seen this kind of tension before, hesitation, uncertainty. And in his line of work, hesitation can be dangerous. Finally, the officer hands back the badge, fingers slightly unsteady. I appreciate your service, he says, trying to sound professional. But just make sure your headlights are on. The agent takes the badge, sliding it back into his wallet without a word. He doesn't confirm or deny anything. Doesn't make a scene, just lets the moment hang there. Then slowly he reaches for the gear shift. But before he can put the car in drive, the officer takes a half step forward. Sir, what kind of assignment were you on? It's a bold question, and the agent knows it. He pauses, eyes flicking up to the officer's face. There's curiosity there, maybe even concern. The officer isn't just trying to get out of an awkward situation anymore. He genuinely wants to know who he just stopped. For a split second, the agent considers telling him. Just a hint, just enough to let him know he's dealing with something far bigger than a traffic violation. But instead, he exhales and shakes his head. You don't want to know. And with that, he shifts into drive. The officer watches, his mind racing with possibilities, as the car pulls away into the night. But something tells him this isn't the last time their paths will cross. The agent glanced at her, as if gauging whether or not to speak. After a moment, he finally looked back at the officer. It's bigger than anything you can handle, he said quietly. We're dealing with something that stretches beyond this town, beyond this state. He paused, his expression darkening. There are people in power who will do anything to keep this under wraps. We're trying to stop them. The officer felt his heart race, his thoughts a whirlwind. His mind flashed back to everything, the odd traffic stop, the strange tension with the agent, the mysterious figure in the car. It all started to come together in a chilling way, but he still couldn't fully grasp what it meant. Stop them from what? The woman's eyes softened for a fraction of a second before she looked away. You're too close now. You've seen too much. If you walk away, it's over. If you keep digging, you won't make it out. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small envelope, handing it to him without a word. This is for you. It explains everything, but you can't go back after reading it. The officer took the envelope, his hands shaking slightly. He didn't want to open it. Not yet. He wasn't sure he wanted to know. But as the weight of her words settled in, he knew he couldn't walk away. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. Why are you doing this? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a step back, her eyes lingering on him, almost as if she were saying goodbye. Because sometimes the truth is too dangerous to leave unspoken. But it's also too dangerous to share with just anyone. She turned to leave, her footsteps echoing in the empty alley, her silhouette swallowed by the darkness. The agent didn't move, but the tension in the air was palpable. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but resolute. You have a choice. You always have a choice. But some paths you can't come back from. The officer stood there for a long moment, the envelope still in his hand. His heart pounded, but his mind was clearer now. He could walk away, pretend this night never happened. Or he could open the envelope and learn what he wasn't supposed to know. With a deep breath, he tore open the envelope, reading the first few lines. The words burned into his mind, but as the truth began to unfold, so did a greater realization. He had crossed a line. And now there was no turning back. The story wasn't over. It had only just begun.